New Westminster, like many other parts of British Columbia, experienced rapid population growth as a result of the gold rush of the mid-19th century. With the influx of workers came a taste for alcohol and a social structure which revolved around the saloon. The first drinking establishments were grouped along Columbia and Front Streets, the two main thoroughfares for the growing city of New Westminster. The Pioneer Saloon on Front Street was one of the first businesses to open in the city in 1861. Meanwhile, the Royal Engineers who established New Westminster created their own saloon, the Retreat, in the same year near their camp in Sapperton. Many others soon followed as the city became the flourishing capital of the colony of British Columbia. The last half of the 19th century brought immense changes to society, economy, and many aspects of daily life. This also included a shift in people's relationship with alcoholic beverages. At this time, beer and wine weren't considered truly intoxicating drinks. It was possible to become drunk on them, but it didn't happen with normal, moderate use. Distilled spirits such as rum and whiskey, on the other hand, were intoxicating, and they were becoming both abundant and affordable. European governments had already grappled with a public health crisis relating to the overuse of distilled alcohol, and Canada began to follow a similar pattern as its population grew. This page from the Council Minutes of 1877 acknowledges a petition requesting that all liquor sellers be required to close on Sundays in an effort to stop wild drinking on the Sabbath. In 1880, there was one licensed bar for every 13 people in New Westminster and many more unlicensed places which sold alcohol at all hours. Besides saloons, hotels were another place where drinking quickly became the norm. The 1878 Dominion Day celebrations at the Colonial Hotel brought hundreds of guests to celebrate with rounds of beer, wine, and spirits. Drinking was woven into the fabric of everyday life, with the saloons and hotel bars serving as non-religious gathering places where citizens could let off steam and enjoy themselves. However, New Westminster did not have sufficient laws in place to regulate alcohol's sale, consumption, or abuse, and thanks to a combination of societal and economic factors, abuse quickly became the status quo. By 1893, the people of British Columbia were drinking 1.5 times as much alcohol as the citizens on the East Coast. Weekend benders became a regular occurrence as men from isolated work camps descended upon the nearest town to cash their checks at the bar and drink until the money ran out. In 1895, the Lord Aberdeen, the 7th Governor-General of Canada, stayed in a New Westminster hotel with his wife, pictured here, and they were given a room above the bar. When the Lord asked the night porter when the bar would be closing so that he and his wife could get some sleep, the porter responded, "It doesn't." Until 1900, many saloons and hotels operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This 1897 police report summarizes the number of people arrested for various offenses, including several related to drunkenness. In the last decade of the 19th century, local and provincial governments began to discuss ways to bring drinking under some kind of control. The existing environment was understandably concerning for many of the citizens of New Westminster, who found the rampant vice to be in conflict with their morals and their way of life. Property values around saloons often dropped as people tried to avoid the drunken revelers. Binge drinkers would sober up only to find themselves injured, jailed, or unemployed due to their antics. The religious temperance movement can be traced to a religious revival which began in the mid-19th century amongst Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists. They preached the social gospel, aiming to change society and eradicate sinful behavior to create a utopian world based on Christian values. For these religious groups, alcohol made an excellent enemy. It caused many ills and exacerbated others. Anglican Bishop Acton Sillitoe, pictured here, was a very public voice in the New Westminster throughout the 1880s, working to reduce the number of saloons in the area. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had a chapter in New Westminster, played a part in spreading prohibition throughout the country. While it wasn't as influential in Canada as it was in the United States, the WCTU gave women a platform to voice their concerns about the social consequences of drinking. In fact, temperance sentiment and women's suffrage became tightly intertwined. Prohibitionists recognized the potential power of women at the ballot box, and it was women who would ultimately decide the fate of liquor laws several decades later. The federal government of Canada tried to take steps towards implementing some kind of prohibition in both 1878 and 1898, but neither one made much of a difference in British Columbia, where the government profited handsomely off of the liquor industry and where most of the citizens didn't care much about the social gospel. Prohibition did not sit well with conservative Premier Richard McBride, who saw temperance movement as a threat to his power base. With a powerful majority government, McBride happily kept temperance whispers to a minimum during the first decade of the 20th century, although he did enact some laws to curb the worst alcohol-related trouble. In 1911, for example, the government amended the BC Liquor Act to ban the sale of alcohol in non-hotel bars, forcing existing saloons to either add as many as 30 rooms to the premises or to close their doors. Sunday and nightly closing laws were also passed, although it took time to consistently enforce them. With the declaration of World War I, the economy of BC essentially collapsed as young men, the main components of the workforce, rushed to enlist in the army. As the fighting dragged on, British Columbians became more socially conservative as they tried to help the war effort in any way possible, including rationing food and supplies. This was perfect ammunition for the prohibitionists. Rather than arguing the moral failings of alcohol to mostly deaf ears, they could rightfully point out the fact that the grain and sugar used to make liquor could instead go towards feeding soldiers overseas. The prohibition movement coalesced into an official group, the People's Prohibition Association, or PPA, who began to bombard Premier McBride with letters demanding a vote on both prohibition and on women's suffrage. Their efforts were met with pushback from local business owners in the liquor trade, including Nels Nelson, the owner of the new Westminster Brewery, who formed a group called the Merchants Protection Association. The MPA published newspaper ads and editorials focusing on the economic benefits of the liquor industry and the healthful benefits of beer. Hounded by negative press due to economic scandals and perceived inaction on social issues, McBride eventually resigned in 1915. His replacement, William Bowser, reluctantly called for a binding referendum to take place on October 1, 1916. The people of British Columbia would vote on two issues, the enfranchisement of women and the prohibition of alcohol. The proposed BC Prohibition Act forbade the possession or sale of alcohol in public spaces. It was still legal to import and drink in a private dwelling, and doctors could still prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes. There were strict punishments for anyone caught selling liquor. A first-time offender would automatically receive 6 to 12 months of hard labor with no option of a fine. Anti-prohibitionists were outraged by the hastily written bill and ran newspaper ads imploring citizens to read the law and realize its many flaws. In the weeks leading up to the referenda, the new Westminster newspapers became flooded with pro- and anti-prohibition ads. The 1916 election saw a dramatic swing towards a liberal majority government, replacing the prohibition-neutral Bowser with the Baptist teetotaler Harlan Brewster as premier. Both prohibition and suffrage passed across the province. In New Westminster, suffrage won by 439 votes and prohibition by 239. While prohibition was set to become law in early 1917, it was delayed by the absentee ballots of soldiers serving overseas. Their votes initially reversed the decision and brought prohibition to a halt, but after investigation it was revealed that several thousand votes were invalid. The Prohibition Act would go into effect on the 1st of October, 1917. After all the drama, moral judgments, and political scandals that characterized the Prohibition movement, the newspaper from that day contains only a small column on page 4 commenting on the smooth and uneventful moment when alcohol became effectively illegal in British Columbia. Upon the passing of Prohibition, British Columbia decreased but did not eliminate its consumption of alcohol. The Act defined liquor as any beverage containing more than 2.5% of proof spirits, a loophole which allowed breweries to manufacture low-alcohol, near beer, and other temperance drinks, and gave hotels and bars something to serve their patrons. In the first few weeks after Prohibition took hold, things seemed to go as planned. Public drunkenness vanished almost overnight, and several small jails were even forced to close due to lack of prisoners. People had more money for Christmas presents, and most hotels managed to stay afloat, at least initially. But the honeymoon couldn't last, and soon the cracks began to show. While near beer was popular, many breweries and hotel bars inevitably went out of business during Prohibition, unable to keep up their sales. The Prohibition Act permitted druggists to sell liquor to those who were ill, which led to a booming industry of prescriptions. Unscrupulous doctors charged patients around $2 for a diagnosis, equal to about $30 in 2016 money, and sometimes wrote out thousands of prescriptions per month. This 1918 scan from a pharmacy book from a local druggist shows multiple prescriptions for brandy, whiskey, and pure alcohol. The People's Prohibition Association quickly found themselves in over their heads. It was almost impossible to keep track of the legal liquor stock, and bar owners quickly learned ways to hide or destroy contraband. On April 1, 1918, the federal government issued an order in council which forbade alcohol importation across the country, but by then bootleggers had swooped in to provide liquor to those who could pay. When the war ended in November of 1918, the best reason for prohibition went with it. Armistice brought soldiers home, but it also created a recession and a crushing $21 million in provincial debt. Before Prohibition, the liquor industry had employed thousands of people and made a lot of money, which was currently going into the pockets of bootleggers. Re-legalizing alcohol seemed like an obvious way to generate revenue. Going back to the wild days of 24-hour saloons was obviously untenable, but an alternative was proposed: government control. The vehemently dry Premier Brewster had been replaced with the more moderate John Oliver, who called for a new referendum to take place in October of 1920. The question was, which do you prefer? 1, the present Prohibition Act, or 2, an act to provide for the government control and sale in sealed packages of spirituous and malt liquors? Once again, the newspapers were flooded with ads that were for and against prohibition, but this time there was a significant difference. Women were able to contribute their votes. The relationship between prohibition and suffrage had been strong enough to merit a simultaneous vote in 1916. For the 1920 referendum, the prohibitionists assumed that women would vote for maintaining the ban, but they were wrong. In the end, British Columbia voted overwhelmingly in favor of government-controlled legal alcohol sales. In New Westminster, the plebiscite passed by 481 votes. This decision prompted the creation of the Liquor Control Board, which served as the framework for the liquor sale laws we use today. On June 15, 1921, the first 9 government liquor stores opened in the province, including one in New Westminster. These establishments were tightly controlled. Windows were painted dark green so that passers-by could not see liquor from the street, and customers had to purchase a permit in order to buy anything. But little by little, alcohol made its way back into New Westminster's bars, restaurants, and homes. With government oversight, it became a normal part of society once again.